Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to quickly just let listeners know that we are recording, both of us are sitting in a heat wave right now. And so you may hear background noise of fans and of things from the open window, or you may see me break out my hand fan even. Um, so just be aware of that. And also, if you have loved ones or pets who are susceptible to the heat right now, um, please reach out and check in on them and make sure that they are okay. On that note, welcome, John Hagen. So glad to see you.
Yo, guys, it's great to be here.
So many of you, especially if you're watching from Windham County, you may know John. He is a retired Air Force officer and former chair of the Windham County Democratic Committee. He was high bailiff for Windham County as well, used to live in Guildford, and now he is zooming in from overseas in Portugal to talk with us today, where he is chapter head of Indivisible Porta. Thank you, John.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Well, let's start with saying happy 250th 4th of July.
Yes, happy Independence Day
Independence Day.
For Americans everywhere.
Well, one reason you and I wanted to talk about that is because 250 is huge, like in such a young country as ourselves.
Yeah.
And yet, I think for many people, this 250th anniversary is not the 250th anniversary they wish it was.
Mm.
So I wanted to get your perspective as someone who is living outside the country right now. What are you sitting with as you look back across the ocean and
Yeah,
250 years?
yeah. So I should say right at the beginning, I'll have very little to say that's coming out of Montpelier. So this is coming out of Porto, Portugal, where there's a very vibrant American community here. About 2,000, I'd say, Americans living in the city. Um, and
That's the size of a small town in Vermont.
it is the size of a small town in Vermont. Yeah, that's a good way to think of it. And in some ways, it almost is a small town in Vermont because everyone seems to know everyone's business. So, uh, well, maybe not everyone's business, but a lot of it. So we're celebrating the 4th of July here in Porto. We have a place that people are gathering together for basically a party. We are lucky. It is the feast day of St. Peter's is also July 4th, which means this being Portugal, there will be fireworks. They're not for the American 4th, but we'll take them out over the river.
Never let good fireworks go to waste.
Yeah. But there has been in the discussions a lot of ambivalence, mixed feelings about how to approach this 250th anniversary.
Mm.
And I know it's not unique to Porto or to Americans abroad. Definitely, these are conversations going on in the United States. I think what makes it interesting being here, and we've been here for about 3 years, kind of looking back at the United States of what's going on, is we get I think sometimes a distorted view
Hmm.
of what is happening in the US. Um, because we get all the news. So the good news, the bad news, the dramatic news, the stuff that sells. Um, what we don't necessarily have is the ground truth, that feel of it, of when we're done reading something in the paper, we're like, I can't believe our country's headed in this direction. Walking back out onto the American street and being grounded in a place and realizing, well, this is still here.
Mhm.
So I worry sometimes that Americans abroad who are overly concerned or not overly concerned, but are concerned about what's going on back in the States, um, tend to be much more zealous about following all the bad stuff and not really having as good a sense of where things are working. That, life is going on, things are progressing, maybe not in the direction or as quickly as we're hoping.
That's fascinating. The journalist in me is really curious. So I do read newspapers outside the US as well. Um,
Mhm.
but I'm always fascinated, and the show does try to de look at the stories we tell about ourselves, which I
Mhm.
think since we're talking about America at 250, we will definitely be
Yeah.
diving into. Do you ever feel too um, like when I read coverage through American newspapers about somewhere abroad or
Mhm.
about America, but from a paper from abroad, I'm always wondering like where that line is between having an outside perspective that allows you to see things someone close up may not see, but
Yeah.
also not understanding the culture you're writing
Yeah.
about. So I'm wondering, do you see that when you read papers talking about America that aren't also based in America? Like,
Yeah. So I'm fortunate that my Portuguese is so poor that the little Portuguese news I read is usually about the weather and how the football teams are doing. But like you, I do follow English versions of that are non-American news sources looking back at what's going on in the US. I think, I mean, clearly, from my perspective, Europeans are fascinated and horrified. Um, I mean, I've spent a lot of time working. I've had the fortune of working in a lot of countries and talking to a lot of people about the United States. Um, and I can be in a country like Niger, which I was in a few years ago, and people would love to talk about traveling to the US, how much they wanted to visit the US. America had this idealistic appeal to it.
hmm,
Interestingly enough, not the same tendency towards China, which was relevant for me because obviously this was a sphere of influence issue of China versus the US in terms of influence in Central Africa.
hmm,
Um, that China might bring in a lot of resources, and I've seen this in a lot of countries, but that's not what inspired people.
hmm,
Um, they'd be happy to take the material resource. What inspired them was this American aspirational idea of freedom, of people have the freedom to go and be something different, to be someone better, and it was their decision to do it. So um, I think people are watching our 250th as Europeans as a continuing experiment to see, does this thing stay together? And I think most, I would be surprised if not almost all, are really rooting for the American experiment to continue. Um, Maybe not, what continue looks like. We're hoping it continues in a good direction, but I think that's where most people, when I'm talking to Portuguese people on the street or in other countries, um, the general sense is people need that democratic experiment to continue on, to be kind of the guide star for them. So here in
hmm.
Portugal was a dictatorship until 1972.
Right.
So from 1920s to 1972, you had the Alberto Salazar dictatorship, and they, like Spain and Greece, right there in the early 70s, all were that last wave or the third wave, I guess, of democratization for European countries. So here we are in a country that's had democracy for maybe 50 years. It is vibrant. There are political parties, people are engaged. Um, they will say they're apathetic. There's a lot of apathy to it, but no, they they have embraced their ability to choose from an umpteen number of parties, but they still look back to the United States as kind of like setting that role model, that guide of where they could be going in terms of individual freedom and people having control over their own government.
You know, one thing that strikes me about what you just said, two things. one, America feels so uninspiring for me right now. Um,
Mhm.
Again, because I am reporting on just a lot of things that are hard. Um, so I really appreciate hearing that. And it makes me a little sad that we might lose that role. Um, but about Portugal specifically, what I find interesting is so 1972, there are probably people who are still alive in Portugal who remember the
Mhm.
dictatorship.
Yeah,
And so they're not taking, my assumption is they're not taking democracy for granted right now.
they are not. I think that's one of the reasons the far right party here in Portugal, not to get way off topic, there is a far right party. It is pushed very hard, been well funded by who, it's not always clear. Um, but it has been significantly defeated recently. And I think part of that is too many people, too many older people and their children remember the fascist dictatorship, and they're like, we don't want that again. It is very easy to compare where Portugal was 50 years ago and where it is today in terms of its just economic well-being and advancement, and attribute that a lot of that to its opening up as a democratic state.
Hmm.
But for Americans, looking back at the US, it has been yeah, how we approach celebrating the 250th anniversary has been incredibly difficult because we do see all the news that is sensational, and most of it is on these erosions of our institutions, the corruption, the undermining of norms that are they're fundamental to our country. So we've spent in our Indivisible group a lot of time talking about, well, what exactly is it we're going to be celebrating on this 250th.
A lot of the folks
And
in my circle are asking the same question, so they're not alone.
yeah, and we kind of have circled back to this idea that what we're celebrating is this was never going to be, there was no finish line. 250 years was not a finish line where we said, democracy achieved, we won, end of history. Um, it is a continuing effort. It is an experiment that continues on. So what we're celebrating is the fact that 250 years in, the experiment still proceeds. Um, and like any experiment, it's going to have great results if we try one thing and less desirable results if we try something else, but we're going to keep trying. Um, and I think that's where we have felt comfortable saying, and I'm speaking for a small group of discussants, that is, we can celebrate that. We can celebrate the fact that the experiment continues. When you look at the Constitution, it says to form a more perfect union. It doesn't say to form a perfect union. There is no perfect. We can pursue more perfect. Um, and the other aspirational line, I think we should always, I was been back in the Declaration of Independence. Um, these self-evident truths, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are always identified. And those are absolutely aspirational and worthy of pursuing. But there's a phrase in between those two. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Among these are
Mm.
life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There are other self-evident truths. Uh, Again, very aspirational document. And it is in that aspiration, this very open document that allows uh, for people to reinterpret it and include more. So it's not just all men are created equal.
Mhm.
It's all men and women, all people are created equal. We do that because this document continues to be an aspirational document. It has space in it for more.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that because when I was sitting getting ready for this conversation with you, I was asking myself similar questions like what do I want to celebrate? And the cheeky part of me is my favorite cousin's birthday, or one of my favorite cousins. I can't pick my favorite, but was born on the 4th of July. So I know my other cousins might get mad at me. And so it's always sort of his birthday first and then the country's birthday. So I've been thinking a lot about Jamie, but when I was sort of struggling with where we are now, and I happened to be listening to the Supreme Court, a few Supreme Court
Hmm.
decisions at the time I was sitting with all this and being very frustrated. Um, what I came down to is I think for me, America has, um, especially for this show where we talk about the story, stories. Um, and as a fiction writer, I always think about the stories characters are telling about the world. But for me, America is the story of that struggle and how we deal with and how we accept or confront that gap between our aspirations and our reality.
Yeah,
And I feel so much better about this 250-year anniversary when, again, I go back to the Great Experiment, looking at the US as an experiment rather something that's been set in stone.
yeah,
Um, and so I appreciate hearing your perspective on that as well, because I admit I have not been feeling quite as inspired or
yeah,
aspirational lately.
yeah. So I think the drawback or the challenge of an aspirational document is that because it is open, it relies so much on a common set of ethics and norms.
Yeah.
Um, because if it's all institutional, yes, laws are absolutely needed. I'm not, clearly institutions are important, but institutions need to be inspired. There's just too much gray area in real life.
Hmm.
Um, and
Well, even in our aspirationals, if you stick on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, nobody defines that the same way.
right, right. And there has to be an acknowledgement that we do define it differently. So
Hmm.
how do we maintain this? Can we maintain this experiment where there's multiple definitions for the objectives? Um, and can we have a process that helps us arrive at a tolerable solution? Um, and I think in this moment, we just have, and we've been through these cycles before. I
I'm going
mean,
to ask you about that.
we barely get through the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and suddenly 1800, well, 1801, we have the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Adams administration.
Hmm.
Almost right off the bat, we're seeing the efforts to shut down opposing ideas, challenges from political opponents, trying to demonize the other. That is not new to this time period. You and I have been talking about, and I'm sure we'll talk more about
Hmm.
Margaret Chase Smith, the senator from Maine, in her Declaration of Consciousness in 1950. And she's seen the exact same thing in the McCarthy era and the Republicans in the Senate of this willingness to go to the bottom, to cast your political opponents as enemies, that loyalty is the most important thing to the party or to the party leader. And she's saying, don't go there. And we are facing, once again, that kind of same situation at the moment. Um,
Hmm.
and
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm not saying we should be complacent, but I think we should draw some comfort from the fact this is a continuing problem. This is not suddenly a crisis we've never dealt with before. Uh,
Well, that's one question I wanted to ask you, and we will touch on Margaret Chase Smith either now or in the second half, but um, because I think her Declaration of Consciousness is worth a read. For listeners, I'll put it in the show notes. But you have studied history on so many levels. I wanted to ask you, at 250, is what we're facing right now with the Trump administration and some and our institutions struggling and that sort of thing, is that normal? Like if you were to compare our history to the history of another country at 250,
mm,
are they facing some of the same things? I mean, Britain has had civil war after civil war after civil war. France. I mean, you could point to so many countries.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think you could. The problem is there's just too many variables. I don't think you could say, well, at 250 years, um, this is what happened. I do think we used to discuss this quite a bit, is what is the life cycle of a democracy?
Perfect.
Um,
Yes.
if a democracy was a human being,
Hmm.
as human beings get older, our arteries get harder, we have less ability to withstand stresses. Um, Small things can build the big things very quickly. Our our bodies just don't respond or adapt as well. What is there an equivalent in the political institutions? Do the institutions become rigid, where they can't respond to stresses or to changes, or are they responding to conditions that no longer exist? Um, so I do think this sounds Pollyannish, but maybe this is a needed phase in a democracy, a
Hmm.
moment of realizing, oh, our democracy is getting overweight and lacking, it has some real norms and ethics problems, name whatever you want to call it. But kind of like the day I realized that, you know what, I really need to get to the gym and get my diet under control or whatever else. Um, Maybe there's a national equivalent to that of, hey, our country, we thought things were going along well and everything was going along smoothly, but suddenly there's this crisis and we have to really take a reckoning of, what's the next step? What are we going to do about this?
Hmm. So you've mentioned norms and ethics a few times, and this does bring me back to the Declaration of Consciousness. Um, One thing when I read through it, a few things stood out, and one of them was what she called the basic principles of Americanism. And for those who don't know, Margaret Smith, Chase Smith was a Republican senator from Maine. I believe she was the first woman to serve in both the House and the Senate. And she was first elected in 1940 to the House and then retired from the Senate in 1973. That's that's a pretty long run. Um,
Oh,
and I admit when it got to the point of her talking about the principles of Americanism, I kind of went like, "Oh God, this is McCarthyism time. This is, she's a Republican." Um, and what she's actually saying to her fellow Republicans is you can't sit around and let someone like McCarthy run the show. This is one of my takeaways. But her principles are the right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, the right of independent thought. And it made me really think about how so many of our checks and balances in our democracy require someone to stand up and say, no, we're going in the wrong direction.
mhm.
And I feel in some ways like we haven't been doing that, at least in our political sphere. I'm wondering what your response to that.
Yeah, the all those rights that are in our Constitution, that are in our Bill of Rights, and what Margaret Chase Smith refers to, only exist if someone's willing to put out the effort and say something unpopular, challenge the authorities, um, be, kind of draw fire on themselves. And that's a tough position because even Margaret Chase Smith is saying, she is vehemently anti-communist.
Hmm.
She is not a progressive lefty Republican. Uh,
No.
she uh, and in fact, she's saying, yes, we have to go after the real communists, and we could have a discussion about what that looked like in the United States. Um,
Yeah.
but she is saying we can't paint everything that we don't like as communist, as if that solves the problem. We can just go after everyone by just calling them a commie, and then we're done with it. And
Hmm.
that is a continuing challenge that we have to this day. In fact, uh, just recently with several of the votes in the primaries in New York and with the new Mayor Mamdani in New York City, we're seeing that phrasing of communism coming back again. Like, okay, here's the go-to boogeyman for the American political discourse. They're communists. Once we label them as a communist, then we don't have to deal with them. We've kind of boxed them, and we all know how we treat communists. So.
Hmm. Well, that's another question I wanted to ask you. And we only have a couple minutes before we need to hear from some underwriters. So I'm going to ask this, but then if we can circle back after the break, I'd
Sure.
appreciate it. I remember you and I having a conversation once. And one thing I've always felt that is a weakness in I don't know how much of it's our culture or how much of it is being human or how much of it is our government, but it feels like, and maybe we need this to unite ourselves because as a country we are so big and so diverse on so many levels, but this need to have an ooga booga. Like,
Hmm.
who's the ooga booga du jour? And for
Yeah.
McCarthy, it was communism. Um, for someone else, it's, the snowflakes, it's the, whomever, it's the
Mhm.
immigrants.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm asking that because what I'd love to hear after the break from you, John, is do you see that too? Is that something that is just human nature and everyone in every country does it? Or is that something that is kind of unique to the US?
Yeah. So I will love to tackle that after the break, with the caveat that I've only lived in Portugal for 3 years, so I do not speak for the entire European community.
I realize it's a broad question, but I guess what I'm really trying to get a handle on is, yeah, how much of it is unique to us
Yeah.
and is something we need to reckon with as a country, or how much of it is just being human, I
Yeah.
suppose.
I think there's a very unique feature on the US part, so we can definitely start back up with that.
Okay, fantastic. So stay tuned, folks. John and I will return in a moment. Hey, beautiful people. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. Before we dive back into my conversation with John Hagen, I want to quickly thank BCTV for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with media centers around Vermont, as well as remind listeners that the views and opinions of everyone on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests and nobody else.
Okay.
Just us.
It might just be us. We don't know.
Yeah, maybe everyone else is sitting listening to this going, oh my gosh, really? So you can always send an email to the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com if you have thoughts that you would like to share with us in response. Um, so John, thank you so much again for being here today. Before the break, I asked the question, you know, is it something unique to the American culture or the American government that we always seem to need a bad guy or what I'm calling the ooga booga du jour? Um,
Mm.
and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Am I in the right vicinity or?
Yeah. And actually, it's a really timely moment to ask that question, because this takes us right back 250 years ago. Because the American Revolution didn't create one country, it created two countries. It created the United States and it created Canada,
Oh.
because all the Tories left the US. They moved up into Ottawa, Ontario, up in across the border.
Hmm.
And the Whigs, which would be the everyone gets a right to vote and classless society, kind of the ideals that we still kind of hold on to in the US, remained in the United States. So at the risk of being seriously overgeneralizing here, um, your class structure persisted more in Canada. And in a class structure, people know where they sit. They might not
Hmm.
like where they sit in it, but they understand the societal structure, who to be careful about, who has to be careful about you, that kind of structure. In a Whig system, everyone's equal.
Hmm.
Well, in a Whig mindset, if everyone's equal, that means that you can harm me and I can harm you. So there's a lot of fear to be had in an everybody's equal setting. So
How
that,
ironic.
yeah. So there has to be something that makes me feel comfortable with this person or that person. How do we form identity groups where I can trust these people because I don't know, they're Red Sox fans, they must be good, or something along those lines. And in a way, that's what sport teams do, is they build these identity communities. But how does that work in the political body? Well, one way that works is to find that outside threat. You know, there's no better way to define who we are than explaining who we are not, who the them is. And so the us versus them mentality is natural in any society. They've got to figure out who we are and who we're not. If you're in a class structure, there's kind of a structure already built of the we's, and there's them and there's us.
Hmm.
If you're looking at a national level, most countries have a dominant ethnic group. So Norwegians speak Norwegian. Um, One of the interesting things I've discovered about being an American in Europe, genealogy is a really different thing for Americans because
Oh,
we're
interesting.
fascinated with all the different places that our parents and our grandparents came from. Um, Europeans, it's kind of, yeah, well, I was born in Germany and my parents were from Germany and their parents were from Germany, and that's the line. So so their identity group is easier to build without having the other. Not to say there's not others out there. I mean, anti-Semitism comes into play dramatically in this, and but this idea of the nation state, the identity of who we are, for those countries becomes a lot easier because of that ethnic background. In the United States, we're from everywhere. We're from Cambodia, we're from England, we're from Spain, we're from Portugal, we're from Nigeria. So what is that identity group that we have? And the ideal, the ideal was it was a civic identity. It wasn't where we were from, it was what we believed in. These truths that we held self-evident. This idea that to be an American was to hold certain beliefs and attitudes about what the role of the government was and the role of the state. And anyone could be an American. You didn't
Hmm.
have to be, you could be naturalized an American very easily relative to the rest of the world. Or you could be born in the United States. But that identity group was based on this civic idea. Well, that works so far, but it also sometimes it's very easy to find that other that's out there to kind of help reinforce our identity. So during the Cold War, yeah, there was a lot less back and forth between the political parties because we had this Soviet Union out there, this other big other out there that helped us really identify ourselves as the United States. And within that, yeah, there was a lot of friction and drama going on, but there was also an identity that was pretty clear of who we were versus who they were. I'm sorry, I'm getting into my teaching, uh,
No, I'm fascinated. I
but
really am. And I'm yeah, so please continue.
well, I just think, you know, with the end of the Cold War, who was the next big threat after Soviet Union? Well, along comes terrorism, international terrorism, and so we play with that one for a while, or not play, but I mean, it fit that role that we needed of that outside other to be pushed back against. I don't know who that is now. It could
Mm,
be China, uh,
yep.
maybe not. Uh, but but if you don't have an outside threat, then you have to find the inside threat. That those people inside who are not really part of you, the
They're not
the
real Americans, quote
they're
unquote.
not really Americans. Yeah. So, and that's the problem with identity groups is they always strive to be more and more pure, which means ejecting people who are less pure. So,
It's interesting you say that because I worry sometimes in Vermont, one of the things is we are a close-knit community, which is really wonderful, but we will fall into those purity
mm,
conversations ourselves sometimes, and it always
real
concerns me.
Vermonter,
Hmm?
the real Vermonter. Who's a real Vermonter? Yeah.
Yep, exactly. I often say the only purity test I really want is my water and my maple syrup.
Yeah.
Beyond
So,
that.
yeah. So back to that civic set of civic virtues that were supposed to make us all the same identity. This is why norms and ethics, I want to get back to that because you
Yes,
brought it up
please
in the
do.
first half, are so important. Our Constitution has structures in it, but a lot of it was also heavily reliant on the expectation that our leaders, our political leaders, and our people had a common set of norms and ethics that would allow us to grow, to deal with different challenges, and still stay within the letter of the law, but not be bound, not be just only following the law, but doing the right thing, improving ourselves. And I think one of the real challenges we have today is our current president has no sense of norms and ethics. And I'll bring up an example from today. This is Thursday, July 2nd, when we're doing this discussion. New York Times article that says, well, Trump knows he has these multiple conflicts of interest, getting this giant jet from Qatar, his cryptocurrency work. He doesn't care
Mm-mm.
about the conflicts of interest. And further, he doesn't think other people care
Right.
about. Well, if that's true, I mean, we have our system relies upon the people actually expecting more out of their leadership, to be the more moral, the more ethical, the leader, not just because they have power, but because they uphold the standards that we all aspire to. And what we're seeing is not just a president who doesn't uphold the standards, but is actively undermining the very belief that that's what we need in our leaders is people with good standards, not how much money they can make for themselves, not much how much power and how much they can browbeat others, but are they good people? Uh, do they lead with moral courage or with some sort of ethical clarity that tells us they did this because it was the right thing to do?
Hmm. Right. Yeah. I think I remember a conversation you and I had once, um, might have been under Trump one, that sums up a little bit what you were saying, that letting a truck go by. Um, you had been talking to some folks you were working with. I think you were in Africa at the time, but that they were watching Trump and they said, for a long time, even if we didn't agree with the United States, a decision the government had made, we trusted that they were being upfront and honest, and that there was always a process in place that they were following. It wasn't
Yeah,
just like willy-nilly decisions that were being
yeah.
made left, right, and center, but that people were starting to doubt that about the United States. Is this kind of the knock-on effect that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think this would be a knock-on. I will say that we are not perceived to be pure Boy Scouts anywhere in the world. Everyone has an agenda. People are always doing things. But what we do as the United States is we do put out these aspirational statements of here's what it means to be a democracy. Here's what people deserve. When we used to hold China accountable for how it was treating its Uyghur minorities or the people in Hong Kong, that was China would say we're just messing around in their business, and that has been the Trump argument of what's not our business, what other countries are doing.
Mhm.
But we were providing, at least at an aspirational level, an idea of, hey, here's how good government should be working for its people. And that is gone now. I don't know, it'd be very hard to find examples of that now. The the loss of USAID, I mean, just to me is just devastating. It was America showing itself to be a more, at least showing a moral behavior with USAID and helping other people.
Hmm.
Not always. Yes, sometimes USAID was very much influenced by foreign policy, but at the end of the day, um, there was that aspirational statement about helping other people.
And so, this civic identity, do you feel historically there has been certain tenets of that civic identity?
Yeah, I think our civic identity is very much grounded in our documents, our Declaration of Independence, back to that 250th, our Constitution. These are, and then all the discourse that comes out of that, that leads to emancipation, that leads to women's suffrage. It is the history of our progress is what our civic identity is. We began with these two documents that kind of give us a starting point, and we have a narrative, sometimes a flawed narrative, uh, and a narrative that sometimes, more often than not, has been rewritten and adjusted to realize, okay, here's what we missed along the way. Uh, but it is a common shared story, because really, at the end of the day, a nation, as it's been defined, is a imagined community that has a shared and common identity. Uh, we are Americans. We identify with each other as Americans, imagined. We might not know each other otherwise, but what we share is this common historical identity. And what's so great about it in the United States is you could show up here in uh, the late 1970s as a Vietnamese refugee. You could have come here in in the 1950s from Italy. You could have come from Portugal in the 60s and 70s, and you're an American. You are, once you've been accepted into that, once you've accepted that civic history, that's your history now.
Mm,
Your your family might have only been in the United States for 10 years, but when you're asked what's the history of your country, that's what we use to build that civic identity.
it's interesting. I'm sitting with how powerful that is because when I lived overseas briefly, I heard that from multiple people um, who had been born, outside the US, saying one thing they found so amazing about the US is that you can become an American at any time.
Yeah,
So that is definitely something that's, you're not just talking about that. That is something that has been felt
yeah,
by people outside the
yeah.
US.
And clearly, that's something that is also under attack at the moment. So,
Yeah.
who gets to be an American? A
And who gets
birthright,
to decide
and who gets to decide?
what it is to be an American and whether you're real? Again, air quotes.
Yeah,
Yep. Um, hmm. What I'm thinking about, John, is when you're talking about the civic identity is how fascinating because it reminds me of an interview I heard a while ago, and I can't remember the book they were talking about, but this idea that to have a democracy, citizens needed to be well informed, they needed to be educated, they needed to be well read, and hence why we have schools, why we have newspapers, why we have libraries, these storehouses of information. Um, and I'm just really sitting with that and how it feels like that's also something that's been under attack
yeah,
lately.
yeah. A informed, educated citizenry is necessary for democracy. If you don't want a democracy, then you don't want an informed and educated citizenry, or at least not a working class one either. I mean, and I know we only have the hour of this show, but uh, we should acknowledge the seam of chattel slavery that runs through American history.
Yes.
And that is part of that identity as well, of how we have wrestled with that. And that is still a part of the narrative that is being competed.
Hmm.
What exactly is that narrative of how we have dealt with slavery and African American rights moving up into the current time? And it is still up for debate. So not everything about this is great by any means. And again, the challenge is there's a certain desire to just paper over that stuff. Well, here's the civic identity you need to have, that
Mhm.
everything was glorious uh, and all the white guys did all the right things. So
Yeah, the shining city on the hill. Yeah, I'm always amazed. And I think that's why what you were saying earlier about when we were talking about who's the enemy and who's the other, how we in American history, the knots we have tied ourselves into to other people
mhm.
and to justify that othering
Yeah,
is just spectacular in a very negative sense. Um, how we will justify who we have othered.
yeah. The birthright citizenship case
Good
uh,
point.
is, I mean, just the timing of it is interesting. Just here we are sitting at the 250th anniversary, and that is not a done deal.
Hmm.
All that is an indication that um, if someone wants to overthrow that amendment, all they need to get is 5 justices on the Supreme Court. You don't need a constitutional amendment. You just need 5 justices. Um, that is a huge issue.
Yeah. Yep.
Um,
I think going forward, here in Vermont, we're going into the primary season and ahead of the August primary and then of course the general elections in or the state elections in November. Um, I think one of the questions I shall be asking any candidates who come on the show, so be prepared, candidate, if you're listening. Yeah, what's your civic identity? And how do you define
what
it?
it is to be American. Yeah.
Yeah, American, Vermonter, whatever. Um, and also, I have to say, I am also very tired of how, often our political discourse, we answer questions by saying, "Oh, well, I'm not so and so, and so that will tell you everything about me." And it's like, no, actually, it doesn't. Um, this we may need to go over time, John, with this next question. But okay, we've talked about all this, right? Civic identity, we've talked about norms. Um, where do we go from here?
Yeah. So before the break, I had mentioned that maybe this moment is our aha moment, our moment that the country needs to get off the couch and get to itself to a gym, whatever that looks like. Uh, and I think it is. I think we have approached a recognition period that the way things were operating isn't functioning anymore.
Hmm.
Not the way that the founding fathers envisioned it, not the way most Americans want it to be. Um, so I think there does need to be, and I think there will be, a call for, well, what do we need to fix? What needs to be adjusted? We relied so much on the president, the office of the president being guided by norms and ethics. Not that they were saints, but that at the end of the day, there was at least a belief that they really had the good of the country in mind. Um, and that allowed an awful lot of room for the president to move around. Uh, and now we have to realize, well, you know what? That's great 99 times out of 100. But then you get that one guy or woman, in this case, guy, who has no norms or ethics.
Hmm.
Um, and you've basically put the fox in the henhouse. Uh, I can get jets, I can get gifts, I can get money, I can enrich my family.
Takes
And there is,
taxpayer money.
right. And I can do this in a way that I never directly violate or so blatantly violate the laws that those people who are on my side are forced to reconcile with that. There's
Mhm.
always going to be a way out. Um, so I think, I don't know what that looks like, but I think there is an anger and an expectation, and or at least from what I can see from my narrow perch here sitting where I am, that something has got to change in the institutions itself. And that might be expanding the Supreme Court, a Supreme Court that, by the way, is way too small for the vast number of people in the expanse of this country. Maybe reducing the term limits from lifetime to a defined term limit. But there's going to have to be some fundamental reforms, I think, and that will be expected.
Hmm. So, one argument I hear from folks who think the Trump administration is doing a good job
Mm.
is that democracy's a mess.
Mhm.
There's too many people, there's too many norms, there's too many rules, it takes too long. And so what we actually need is like a strong man, a dictator, someone
Mhm.
who will just come in and get things done.
Yeah,
Are you feeling we're at a point where maybe we do need to stop looking at ourselves as a democracy, or is it kind of it's still the way that works best for us? What are
I
your
think the
thoughts?
democracy way still works best. I think the Trump administration has actually highlighted why we don't want a dictator. It might have sounded appealing, the strong man who cuts through the red tape and does the right things, and everything works out well. Um, but the reality is, dictators might have some ability, the perception that they cut through the red tape and they get things done, but do they do the right things? Yes, you can hire your pool guy on a no bid contract to reseal the reflecting pool, but was that the right thing to be done? Uh, Dictatorships are, and this is why they have to seize all the institutions of government very quickly, is because they tend to be incredibly incompetent and corrupt. And if they don't control the news, um, the courts, their parliament or their Congress, they're going to get kicked out. So they have to seize those very quickly. And that's what we've seen with the Trump administration is this almost, these are my judges in the Supreme Court, or literally the Speaker of the House will not take an action now unless he gets the nod from the president to do that. So this whole independent Congress. So I think, yes, there's going to have to be some changes so that we don't have the next aspirational dictator coming along to try the same thing again.
Hmm. I'm going back to and I agree with you. I think in general, just me personally, I always worry a little bit about centralized power.
Mm.
In any system, uh, well, let me take that back. Any system that needs to be long term. There are times where, like emergency services, one person's in charge and they're telling the firefighter where to put the hose and who to go into the building and who comes out, and they're kind of in charge. But that's a very short term, very specific use. I feel when you're talking about people, you need decentralized power, groups of people. Um, I'm not being very eloquent about this, I realize. Um, but yeah, I think in part that's what I'm sitting with right now is that idea that getting things done requires much more of a centralized set of power, I feel, than the democracy actually benefits from. That
Right.
making sense?
It kind of does. I mean, democracy relies on expertise. There's a reason the far right does not like expertise and likes to go with gut feeling. Um, but democracy, you have a marketplace of ideas that have to be vetted and decided which one is the best idea, and expertise kind of comes out of that. So it's not just my pool guy, he's going to do this. It's like, no, let's bid out this contract. Let's figure out the best thing to be done here. But it's a slow process.
Mhm.
And this may be one of the challenges for in the US is where we're conditioned to solve problems. That is
Mm.
unique. I think in the American culture is problem solve it. We have movies that begin with disaster situations, and in 2 hours we'll have solved the problem. Our sitcoms run for 30 minutes, they can resolve a situation. Uh, some things just take a little longer to be done, and it's very easy to exploit people to say, oh, the government's not getting this accomplished yet. If I was in charge, this would be done already. Yes, there's obviously inefficiencies and all sorts of redundancies in government that make it arduous and slow. Come to Portugal. They love they love their bureaucracy here. You buy a banana at the grocery store, you get a receipt that's like that long. But anyway, I digress. But I do think democracy and expertise go together. And the way you weaken a democracy is you get rid of the experts and you put in your cronies. In fact, why do you have Secretary Hegseth as your Secretary of Defense? Doesn't know, hasn't had the training, the skill set, the experience to do it, because he knows the only reason he's in that power position is because the president put him there. And as long as he stays in the president's favor and he's loyal to the president and obedient to the president, he will remain as the secretary, because he's not there based on legitimacy or competence. He's there based just on this connection to the president.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if you just heard that crow. Crow had some feelings on the matter. Um, so we are just about out of time, John, but I want to make sure we close up all the many threads we started pulling on.
It's a lot of threads.
Which means we may just have to have more conversations. Well, I appreciate you being here because I am fascinated by history, but I'm not a historian. Clearly. Um, I come at history a lot as a fiction writer, actually, like who feels they're the hero of the story in this moment, whether they are or not, right? Like whose perspective is this from? So I appreciate you grounding the conversation so much today. It was really wonderful. What do you want to leave listeners with?
I want to leave them with my opinion that as difficult as this 250th Independence Day is, I would say the most difficult July 4th there ever was for the American government, for the American society, was the very first one in 1776. When Thomas Jefferson writes and they proclaim the Declaration of Independence and they ride that thing out into the across the colonies, there was no guarantees there. There was a British army that was considered the best in the world that they were going to go up against. They couldn't agree hardly on anything within that first Continental Congress. There were Tories, loyalists all over the place. It wasn't like the American public had put forward this demand for independence. This was a bold claim being sent out with the hope that it would capture the support of enough people that would carry it through. That those people who signed that thing weren't going to end up hung a month or two later by a British army. So it's sometimes as dire as it might feel at the moment, as perilous as it might be, we've been through this before. We've been through it even worse than before. So I have hope. I have optimism that we will take this moment and we will do what Americans have always done. Maybe not as efficiently as possible, maybe with lots of mistakes, but we will move forward on this.
John Hagen, thank you very much. You helped restore some of my enthusiasm for the 250th anniversary as well. Um, thank you for being here. Happy 4th of July.
Happy 4th of July to you as well.
Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in. The Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW every Friday at 2 p.m. and rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings and wherever you find your podcast, as well as on BCTV. Take care of each other. And if you're celebrating this weekend, happy 4th of July.